She cooked for Hitler and vanished without a trace. Before her name was buried beneath history's rubble, Constanze Manziarly stood at the edge of evil's kitchen, quietly preparing meals for the most feared man in the world. Her hands stirred pots and plated food while bombs exploded overhead and genocide raged outside the bunker walls. Then she disappeared. No trial, no grave. Just silence. Who was she? Why did she stay? And how could a woman so close to Adolf Hitler become one of the war's most enduring mysteries? Her name was barely mentioned in war records. For decades, she was just a footnote until a bundle of handwritten letters sent to her sister from inside Hitler's inner circle resurfaced. They changed everything. Within them were the final thoughts of a woman who had cooked for a dictator, watched him unravel, and stood closer to death than she ever imagined. This is the forgotten story of a young Austrian woman trained in nutrition and domestic science who found herself in Hitler's service not through loyalty, but circumstance. From 1943 to 1945, Constanze Manziarly was Adolf Hitler's personal cook and dietitian, preparing his strictly vegetarian meals with religious attention to detail. She wasn't a Nazi official. She wasn't a true believer. She was, by all accounts, a professional, a nutritionist with a job. But that job placed her in the heart of one of history's darkest regimes. In the final months of the war, while generals panicked and cities crumbled, Constanze was still in the kitchen, still working, still watching. And what she saw in those final days, the paranoia, the delusions, the fear, would never leave her. Her letters capture it all. A regime in collapse, a leader gone mad, and a cook who bore silent witness. This is not just a story about food. It's not even just a story about war. It's about being trapped in a place where evil wasn't just shouted. It was served, on plates, in silence. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of Manziarly's life in Hitler's service. What she endured, what she recorded, and what remains unresolved. Her story is quiet. It doesn't scream for attention, but it lingers. From honor to horror, prestige to paranoia. Her descent was swift and silent, and it all began with a meal. Constanze Manziarly was born in 1920 in Innsbruck, Austria. Raised in a well-off, culturally refined family, she pursued studies in nutrition and home economics, a field deeply rooted in science, care, and order. She wasn't born into politics or ideology. Her early life was simple, even serene. She believed in structure, health, and quiet service, traits that would tragically place her in the eye of history's darkest storm. In the early 1940s, Adolf Hitler was becoming increasingly paranoid about his health. He obsessed over his digestion, weight, and diet. His vegetarianism wasn't an ethical stance, it was an extension of his deepening fear of betrayal and contamination. Poison, he believed, could be anywhere, in meat, in sauces, in bread. And so he wanted someone to oversee every bite he consumed. Enter Constanze. Her education, demeanor, and unwavering discipline made her the perfect candidate. She was calm under pressure, articulate, and entirely focused on precision. In 1943, at just 23 years old, she was selected to join Hitler's household staff. Not as a soldier or strategist, but as his personal dietitian. The role was prestigious, highly confidential, and intensely demanding. When Constanze arrived at Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof, she was struck by its stillness. The security was intense. The routines were almost sacred. She'd imagined she'd be working in a prestigious environment. What she found instead was something far more unsettling. It was a place where time was micromanaged, where spontaneity didn't exist, and where silence carried weight. At first, she was proud. She believed she had been chosen for a role of national importance. To many Germans, Hitler was a mythic figure, a man who had resurrected Germany from economic despair. To be near him was to be part of history. But Constanze quickly learned that she wasn't near history. She was inside a pressure cooker. Every meal had to be precise, every ingredient scrutinized, every preparation reviewed. Hitler's paranoia meant that nothing could be left to chance. Constanze wasn't just cooking, she was managing a daily performance of control. She soon realized she couldn't leave, couldn't complain, couldn't falter. And above all, she couldn't be seen as weak. There were no weekends, no sick days, just relentless duty beneath the eyes of guards and ideologues. The kitchen was cold, the air heavy, her smile rehearsed. What began as a role of respect became a brutal lesson in silent endurance. At first, it seemed like a dream job. Constanze was stationed close to one of the most powerful men in Europe. The marble halls, polished uniforms, and structured routines gave off an aura of significance. This was the epicenter of Nazi power, disciplined, calculated, and meticulously maintained. To the outside world, she held a position of great privilege, but inside those stone walls, something was deeply wrong. The deeper she moved into this world, the more the illusion began to crack. The kitchen wasn't a place of creativity or joy. It was a stage for anxiety. Every dish had to meet impossible standards. If the soup was too hot or the potatoes slightly overcooked, there might be no outburst. But the silence that followed could feel like a verdict. Constanze realized she wasn't just a chef. She was a gear in a cold, mechanized regime. There were no weekends, no breaks, no holidays. Mistakes were unspoken, but not unnoticed. She wasn't praised, she was tolerated. Her job wasn't just to cook. It was to anticipate, to correct, to endure. Hitler's dietary demands were dictated by fear of poisoning, fear of weakness. Every ingredient required approval, every portion dissected for consistency. She often worked under the eyes of physicians and aides, preparing food with the weight of paranoia looming over her. Meals turned into rituals, measured, rehearsed, sacred. Constanze could no longer tell if she was nourishing a man or appeasing a monster. Surveillance wasn't limited to the hallways. It reached into the kitchen, woven into every interaction, every command. She didn't feel trusted, she felt inspected. The admiration she may have once had melted into dread. Hitler's erratic outbursts, obsessive habits, and growing detachment from reality seeped into the air. Even her workspace was suffocating. She wasn't allowed to show fatigue or emotion. There was no margin for being human. She began writing more frequently to her sister, cautiously describing her exhaustion. In one letter, she confessed to baking for hours, only to watch the pastries disappear during Hitler's late-night tirades. Every evening, she wrote, "It's always gone, but nobody ever says a word." Constanze wasn't a political actor. She didn't speak ideology. She didn't resist or rebel. She endured. Trapped in a role that demanded silent perfection, she was a civilian shackled by proximity to power. The illusion of prestige had shattered. All that remained was duty without dignity and the quiet realization that she was no longer free. By the end of 1944, Constanze Manziarly was emotionally spent. What had begun as a professional challenge had become a mental siege. Each day bled into the next, marked not by satisfaction but by the quiet dread that filled the kitchen. The walls of Hitler's world were closing in, and so were hers. There were no direct outbursts aimed at her, but the tension was suffocating. Hitler's mood swung without warning. One moment he muttered a vague compliment. The next he sat in silence, lips tight, eyes hollow, lost in delusions. He raged behind closed doors, about traitors, the Jews, the Allies, and his own failing generals. Constanze didn't need to be in the room to hear it. His voice traveled. His venom echoed. Her letters to her sister began to change. Once dry and professional, they now pulsed with fatigue. She described baking alone for hours, preparing every dish to exacting standards, without help, without thanks. "The burden I carry is not the food," she wrote. "That's what the food represents. It's what I have to swallow in silence." Meals were no longer about sustenance. They were rituals of delusion. Hitler's meals were tasted for poison, plated with precision, and served on time, as if timing could hold the war together. Constanze realized she wasn't feeding a man anymore. She was helping keep up a dying illusion. Order on the plate, chaos everywhere else. At night, she baked cakes under stress, knowing they'd be devoured during Hitler's venomous monologues. He would rant about Jews while slicing into dessert, she wrote. It felt obscene. The sweetness of sugar couldn't mask the bitterness of hate. She came to loathe the contrast, the beauty of her work set against the filth of his words, and fear tightened its grip. Her role, though civilian, offered no freedom. She could not ask to leave. She could not object. Requests were ignored. Doors remained shut. Her body stayed in the kitchen, but her mind paced like a prisoner. There was no warmth, no praise, no break. Only silence, surveillance, and the sense that something monstrous was unraveling, not just around her, but inside her. She described the bunker as a cold box of shadows. A place where people whispered of cyanide and disappearances. Psychological collapse doesn't always explode. Sometimes it erodes. Constanze didn't scream or sob. She unraveled quietly, one plate at a time. By early 1945, Constanze Manziarly had moved from alpine retreats to a concrete tomb. The Führerbunker. Hidden beneath the battered streets of Berlin, the bunker served as the final refuge for a regime collapsing in real time. The once proud Nazi empire had been reduced to smoke, ruin, and dread. And Constanze, the silent dietitian, was now trapped at its epicenter. The bunker was grim. It reeked of smoke, mold, and despair. Its narrow corridors were dimly lit, its air stale and heavy. The ceiling leaked. The walls shook from the constant drumbeat of Soviet artillery. Above, Berlin was burning. Below, an empire was dying in slow motion. Constanze's duties hadn't changed, but the environment had. Her kitchen was barely operational. Ingredients were scarce, the stove unreliable, the knives dulled from overuse. And yet, she was expected to perform the same culinary rituals with a mask of calm. Hitler's meals were still strictly vegetarian, still prepared with ceremony, though the illusion of order was fading fast. Her letters home became less frequent and more cryptic. "I feel I have one foot in the grave," she wrote. "I am not exaggerating. I encounter unimaginable difficulties that I cannot report." The tone had shifted. This was no longer a job, this was survival. She no longer sounded like a professional. She sounded like a prisoner describing a slow, suffocating descent. Daily life in the bunker followed a grotesque routine. Meals were served at set times as if the clock could keep the end at bay. Hitler, pale and trembling, still called for dinners, surrounded by aides and generals who mimed normalcy. He muttered about betrayal, ordered defenses that didn't exist, and cursed enemies no longer listening. Constanze saw it all: the pacing, the twitching, the rage that had once roared now reduced to a slow, venomous hiss. His authority was still feared, but it no longer inspired. His presence was less human, more ghost. Suicide whispers spread through the halls. Cyanide capsules passed hand to hand like currency. Children played in one room while plans for mass death were made in another. The bunker was a paradox, death and denial cohabiting under one reinforced ceiling. And through it all, Constanze worked. No applause, no thanks, just another meal, another day, another step toward the end. The Führerbunker was no shelter. It was the grave of a nation's delusion, and Constanze Manziarly was entombed in it, alive. Constanze Manziarly wasn't a military strategist or political insider, but she was closer to Hitler than most. Every day, she observed the man behind the myth, the one history paints in thunderous speeches and iconic images. But up close, she saw something different. She saw a man unraveling, a regime disintegrating, a myth collapsing into flesh and fear. By April 1945, the mask had disintegrated. Hitler's once booming voice had become a hushed tremble. His posture sagged under the weight of reality. His hands shook incessantly. His eyes were hollow, sunken into a gaunt face stripped of its former menace. The man who once incited millions now struggled to lift a fork. And yet, routines continued. Constanze still prepared meals with care. Vegetarian stews, mashed potatoes, broth. Each dish was plated as though it mattered. But the food tasted like ash, and no one around the table spoke much. Faces were gray, smiles extinct. The bunker was a shell of formality housing a dying cause. Hitler insisted on order, clinging to mealtimes as if they could delay the inevitable. The air inside the bunker had changed. It was heavier, full of whispered doubts and quiet panic. Outside, Berlin burned. The Red Army was within blocks. Inside, suspicion rotted trust. Constanze saw it in the way glances lingered too long, the way voices dropped mid-sentence. She continued her work with practiced calm, but the letters she managed to send told a different story. In one, she described a dinner where Hitler sat in silence, unmoving. "He is no longer here," she wrote. "Only the shell remains." Fear saturated the bunker. Suicide was no longer abstract. It was protocol. Cyanide capsules passed from hand to hand like currency. "If the Russians find us," someone whispered, "they'll drag us through the streets like animals." Constanze was there when Hitler began selecting who would stay and who would die. She watched him issue orders into phones that connected to no one. His world had shrunk to a gray corridor lined with shadows, and so had hers. There were no more illusions. No speeches, no victories, just routine and ruin. Constanze peeled vegetables. She stirred broth. She laid cutlery at place settings for men preparing to disappear. She didn't scream. She didn't protest. She endured, quietly, mechanically, one terrifying, surreal day at a time. Constanze Manziarly didn't just witness the collapse of the Third Reich. She lived inside it. And it lived in her until she vanished. Amid the bunker's crumbling order and Hitler's unraveling sanity, Constanze Manziarly encountered something unexpected. Favoritism. But it wasn't warm. It wasn't personal. It was awkward, off-key, and deeply unsettling. Hitler rarely spoke to her directly, but when he did, it was almost performative. One day, after sampling a dessert she had prepared, he casually remarked that her name reminded him of Mozart's wife. "I have a cook with a Mozart name," he muttered. It wasn't delivered with charm. It lacked warmth. It lacked warmth. It was as if he were admiring an antique, not speaking to a living human being. These weren't acts of kindness. They were gestures of control, wrapped in flattery, hollow in emotion. Once, with no context or ceremony, he handed her a pair of thick woolen stockings. No eye contact. Just a mechanical comment about staying warm. In another setting, it might have been polite. In the Führer bunker, where suicide plans hung in the air and the world above burned, it felt like a glitch in reality. Constanze wrote about it with dry humor. The boss was falsely taught about ladies' fashion tastes, she told her sister in a letter. The words carried exhaustion tinged with disbelief, not amusement. To Hitler, people weren't people. They were functions. Constanze cooked, she complied. And in return, she received tokens. Not gratitude. Not trust. A name dropped in conversation. A pair of socks. That was how he navigated intimacy. Through symbolism and utility, not empathy. Constanze never described feeling seen or appreciated. Her letters didn't echo gratitude. Instead, they chronicled the surreal contradiction of a dictator who could plan death before dinner and hand out clothing after. One moment, she was feeding a man who preached extermination. The next, she was being handed wool socks like a favored guest. It didn't make sense. That was the point. In the bunker, humanity had been replaced by ritual. Relationships were performative. Gestures were strategic. Compliments were mechanical. Constanze understood this. She didn't resist the gifts. She accepted them because resistance was dangerous, but she knew exactly what they meant. They weren't about her. They were about him. Control masked as civility. Propaganda disguised as politeness. A dictator pretending to be dignified while the ceiling cracked overhead. She wasn't appreciated. She was convenient, useful. That was Hitler's version of favoritism. Cold, transactional, and terrifying. April 30, 1945. Adolf Hitler's final day alive. Above ground, Berlin was a graveyard. Buildings smoldered. Fires raged in silence. Soviet troops were mere blocks away. The city was no longer a battlefield. It was a husk, a ruin wrapped in smoke and sorrow. And deep beneath it, in the Führer bunker, Constanze Manziarly prepared one last meal. Routine didn't stop, not even at the edge of oblivion. That morning, she was summoned to the kitchen. Despite the chaos, despite the whispers of suicide and collapse, lunch was still expected. The schedule held, even if history was breaking apart. There was no grandeur, no ceremonial feast, just a final vegetarian meal. Mashed potatoes, a light broth, maybe a bit of pasta or rice. The pantry was nearly bare. Ingredients were limited. Constanze worked with what she had. Hitler's appetite had shriveled. His frame had diminished. His skin was gray. His presence ghost-like. He looked less like a dictator and more like someone already gone, just waiting for time to catch up. Wait. She prepared the meal in silence. The kitchen, once tense, now felt hollow. Voices were faint, movement mechanical. Every action was deliberate, slow, final. She plated the food, walked it to him, and placed it before him on the table. No words were spoken, no gratitude offered. Only the subtle scrape of cutlery on porcelain. The quiet rhythm of a man eating while preparing to die. Eyewitnesses later said Hitler seemed peaceful, resigned. His fury had faded. He barely touched the food. After a few bites, he stood and retreated into his private chamber with Eva Braun. By evening, they were both dead. Suicide by cyanide and pistol. The long-threatened ending had finally arrived. For Constanze, that meal was the last known act of her service, a closing note in a dark symphony. She didn't know it then, but it was also her final footprint in the historical record. The last confirmation of her existence in the shadows of the dying Reich. She had prepared food for a monster, and then she disappeared. No one remembers the recipe. No one knows if she cried after. But the moment remains. a woman setting a plate as the world collapsed. A cook offering sustenance to death itself, Constanze Manziarly's final task wasn't political, it was intimate, human, and devastatingly unforgettable. With Hitler dead and the bunker descending into chaos, Constanze Manziarly attempted to escape. The order of the regime had disintegrated. Suicide followed suicide. The whispers became action. Those who remained either surrendered to death or clung to any chance of survival. Constanze chose the latter. On May 1, 1945, just one day after Hitler's death, she joined a small escape group led by SS officer Wilhelm Mohnke. Among them were Hitler's valet Heinz Linge and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. Their plan was daring: to flee Berlin and surrender to Western Allied forces. They believed that falling into American or British hands meant a sliver of mercy. The alternative, captured by the Soviets, was too terrible to consider. Constanze wore a makeshift SS uniform to blend in. She carried only a small bag. Under the cover of darkness, the group navigated the ruined city, dodging debris, Soviet patrols, and the smell of death that lingered in every corner. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a tomb. At some point near a train station or checkpoint, the group was intercepted. Gunfire echoed. Orders were shouted. In the confusion, Constanze became separated. Witnesses later recalled seeing her being detained by 2 Soviet soldiers. And then she was gone. No body was found. No documents surfaced. Her name disappeared from official records. She vanished as if history swallowed her whole. Speculation followed. Some claim she was executed on the spot either for wearing a uniform or for her proximity to Hitler. Others believe she was taken for interrogation, perhaps by Soviet intelligence, then silenced. There are even rumors, though unproven, that she may have escaped, taken on a false identity, and vanished into post-war Europe or even South America. But there is no trail, no letter, no photograph. Only absence. Her family searched for decades. They sent inquiries, filed reports, pleaded for answers. None came. It was as though she'd never existed beyond that bunker. Constanze's disappearance isn't just a historical mystery, it's a metaphor. She lived in the margins of power, watching madness from the edge. And in the end, like so many in her orbit, she vanished into silence. Her fate mirrored the very regime she once served. Crumbling, obscure, and unanswered. She had prepared meals for the architect of destruction. Then she became a footnote, a ghost. In wars of millions, a single woman can be forgotten. But in her vanishing, Constanze Manziarly left behind a haunting echo that even those who served quietly can disappear just as quietly and still be remembered. Constanze Manziarly's story didn't end with a dramatic trial or a public reckoning. It ended in silence. She faded from history the way a shadow disappears when the lights go out. But her role, though quiet, was anything but insignificant. She didn't command armies. She didn't sign death warrants. She cooked, and yet she stood inside one of the most terrifying regimes in history and watched it crumble from the inside. She was closer to Adolf Hitler in his final days than almost anyone alive. While the world speculates about what happened in that bunker, Constanze was there. RSO. And though she never gave a public account, her letters, those fragile, frightened notes to her sister, became her confession. In them, we don't find hatred. We don't even find loyalty. We find fatigue, confusion, fear. She didn't write like a true believer. She wrote like someone trying to survive, trying to stay sane while the world burned around her. Her story is a stark reminder. Tyranny isn't built by monsters alone. It's upheld by routines, roles, and people who say nothing. Not every cog in the machine is made of steel. Some are made of flesh, tired, terrified, and trapped. Constanze didn't see herself as a villain, nor a hero. She saw herself as a professional, a dietitian doing her job. But in a war like that, no job is neutral. When you serve evil, even silence becomes complicity. Her legacy is not one of absolution, but of warning. Her disappearance isn't just a tragic mystery, it's a metaphor. A symbol of how a regime built on secrecy, fear, and death consumes not only its enemies, but also its servants, especially the quiet ones. History tends to remember the loudest names, the highest ranks, the speeches shouted through microphones. But sometimes the most haunting legacies belong to those who whispered, obeyed, and vanished. Constanze Manziarly wasn't an architect of atrocity, but she was in the room. She stirred soup while bombs fell. She plated meals for a man plotting genocide. And in her silence, we hear the slow decay of morality. She isn't remembered because she was powerful. She's remembered because she was present, a woman who bore witness to the death of a dictator and the death of decency. She cooked for the devil, and then she was gone. What would you have done in her place? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.